Welcome to video 8 for EDFD459. In this video I'm going to be talking to you about the architecture of learning. When I refer to the architecture of learning, I'm talking about the structure of EDFD459 and how it's been built up to facilitate both autonomous and collaborative learning. You will notice from the documentation on the Blackboard unit that there are various different names that are being used, various different naming conventions, and it's important that we understand how and why they're being used before we start the unit so that you have a full understanding of what is expected of you and the pathways towards a focused learning experience. So first of all, I'd like to have a quick talk about the learning pods. So here the learning pod is represented as a green circle, and all of you will be in a learning pod. Each learning pod has 4 members, and throughout the whole unit there are 30 learning pods. When you're operating in your learning pod, this is where you discuss the content for each learning module, and the discussions you have are private to the 4 members of that learning pod. So somebody not in your learning pod would be unable to see what you were discussing. At the end of each learning module, using the starter wrapper process, you will submit your synthesization of the content as a podcast. As well as learning pods, we also have learning studios. And within each learning studio, there are 15 pods. So, if you start discussing content for a learning module within your learning studio in a discussion board that has been made available, everybody within that learning studio can see the content that you're discussing. Now it's important to remember that whilst the discussions you're having in the learning studio are not part of the assessment criteria for EDFD459, it is crucial that you learn how to discuss with fellow unit members about content and have debate with them, have discussion with them, and find out more than you are talking about just within your pod. What you will find is that as you're discussing in the bigger picture of your learning studio, there will be information and knowledge out there that will be very applicable to the conversation you're having within your learning pod. One of the overarching themes and aims of EDFD459 is to develop your ability at self-directed learning. If you approach everything that you do within this unit just as an assessed item, you're not going to get very far. You need to be able to see that it's so important to have these conversations with other people in the unit. That doesn't mean that it's going to be assessed and that it's going to give you an HD, but it's about learning from each other and broadening your horizons and opening up your mind. Now, as well as the learning pods within the learning studios, we also actually have enough pods to create 2 learning studios. So we have 2 learning studios with 15 learning pods within each. And we also have 4 learning modules, and the learning modules contain the content for the unit. So the learning pods and the learning studios contain the people, and the learning modules contain the content. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, it's important to understand at this point how you as an individual and you as a group interact with the learning modules. So, you're working in your learning pod, that's you and 3 other students, and you discuss the content for each learning module. So each learning pod engages with each learning module. So here on the visual, you'll see that there are connections between each pod going to each learning module. And that is a private discussion between the members of each learning pod. But you can also engage with the content of the learning module as a learning studio. So your 15 learning pods and the members within can have an open discussion in the learning studio about learning module content or anything that they find relevant to do with EDFD459 and learning spaces. And finally, each individual, each learning pod, each learning studio, and the 4 learning modules make up the unit. So let's just recap. As an individual, you are a member of a learning pod. As an individual, you're also a member of a learning studio. Each learning pod contains 4 people, and those 4 people will discuss the learning module content and will submit a podcast at the end of each learning module. And that is your assessed criteria for assessment number 1. As a member of a learning studio, each learning studio has 15 pods in it, it's open content, so it's open discussion, and it's learning from each other and broadening and expanding your horizons. So as a learning pod, you can engage with the learning module content, and as a learning studio, you can engage with the learning module content. And combine all of that together, and you have the whole unit for EDFD459. Now, embedded within that whole architecture of learning is also myself, lecturer in charge for the unit. I haven't put that down on the visual because I'll be jumping in and out of everybody's conversations and finding what's going on. But I hope you understand from this visual how the structure of the unit is being put together and why it's being put together as it is. Feedback from EDFD460, an online unit that I was looking after last semester, suggested that whilst the groups of 4 work well, it would also be good to be able to have conversation with other members of the unit. And that is why I have now decided to split it into the learning pods, the learning studios, and the unit as a whole. The learning studio will now facilitate that open conversation that was unavailable in the online unit last semester. I hope this makes a little bit of sense to you. As we go through the unit, I'm sure that the architecture of learning will begin to change, and we'll find other avenues of conversation as well. And as they do change, and as they do update, I'll make sure that I update this visual as well.